The Cimarron River ran black in October, swollen with the first hard rains of autumn, and it carried with it the kind of cold that didn't just chill the skin. It reached down into a person's chest and squeezed. Temperance Vallo had crossed it on horseback 3 days ago, and she hadn't been warm since. She was 23 years old, riding a borrowed gray mare that was too old and too slow for the distance she was trying to cover, and she had exactly one destination in her mind: the federal marshal's office in Dodge City, Kansas. Everything else, the life she'd had before, the name she'd been born with, the family she'd believed in, she had decided to leave on the south bank of the Cimarron like a coat that no longer fit. The prairie wind in the Oklahoma Territory in 1887 was not a gentle thing. It came off the flat, open grasslands with a purposeful cruelty, bending the buffalo grass sideways and pressing against a rider's face like a cold, wet palm. Temperance had grown up in this country. She knew its moods the way she knew her own heartbeat. But knowing the land and surviving it were two separate conversations. She was 3 miles west of a town called Greer's Crossing when the mare stumbled. It wasn't a dramatic fall. The horse simply stepped wrong into a prairie dog burrow hidden beneath the yellowed grass, felt something give in her left foreleg, and stopped moving. Temperance had barely enough time to kick free of the stirrups before the animal went sideways. She hit the ground hard on her left shoulder, rolled, and came up on her knees with the wind knocked entirely out of her lungs. She lay there for a long moment, staring up at a sky the color of pewter, trying to remember how to breathe. The mare stood a few feet away, head hanging, not putting any weight on the injured leg. Temperance knew, without needing to examine it, that the horse wasn't going to carry her another mile. She pressed her forehead against the cold ground, closed her eyes, and allowed herself exactly 10 seconds of despair. Then she got up. She unstrapped her saddlebags from the listing mare, checked that the mare's leg wasn't broken clean through. It wasn't, just badly wrenched, which meant the animal could rest and possibly recover if someone found her, and she started walking west. The thing strapped around her torso under her riding coat made walking uncomfortable. It always did. The leather belt dug into her ribs on the left side where the buckle sat, and the weight of what was packed into it shifted with every step, an uneven, grinding pressure against her sternum. She had worn it for 11 days now. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to breathe, without it pressing against her, almost. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the space of an hour. The sky, which had been merely overcast, turned an ugly, bruised purple along the western horizon. Temperance recognized that color. She had seen it her whole life. It was the color of a plain storm that meant business. She started walking faster. She didn't make it to Greer's Crossing. The storm came down on her with the speed and indifference of a collapsing wall. Within minutes, the visibility dropped to nothing. A howling, horizontal curtain of sleet and freezing rain that soaked through her canvas riding coat in seconds. The trail she'd been following disappeared. The landmark she'd been using, a lone cottonwood, a distant limestone escarpment, vanished entirely into the white static of the storm. Temperance wrapped her arms around her own chest, ducking her head against the wind, and kept moving in what she believed was west. She almost walked directly into the fence post. It was a split-rail fence, the old kind, weathered to silver, running north to south across the prairie. She grabbed it with both hands and let out a sound that wasn't quite a word. A fence meant a ranch meant shelter. She followed the fence line north, stumbling over the rough ground, until the dark shape of a structure materialized out of the sleet. It was a barn, large, solidly built from weathered timber and limestone, with a heavy sliding door on iron rails. She hauled on the door with both hands, the frozen metal burning her palms through her gloves, until it rolled open far enough for her to slip inside. The smell hit her first. Hay, horse, leather, and the deep organic warmth of large animals generating heat. It was one of the most welcome smells she had ever encountered. She pulled the door shut behind her, plunging herself into the amber darkness of the barn's interior, and simply stood there for a moment with her back against the wall, breathing. There were 4 horses in the stalls, well-kept, well-muscled animals, the kind that cost real money. Ranch horses, not farm plugs. The tack hanging on the wall was oiled and maintained, the tools racked neatly, the feed bins covered. Someone took serious care of this place. above. She found a pile of empty burlap grain sacks in the corner and wrapped them around her shoulders, then dropped into the hay at the back of the last empty stall and pulled her knees to her chest. She was going to rest for 1 hour, just one. Then she would find the ranch house, explain herself, and get back on the road in the morning. She was asleep in under 4 minutes. She didn't hear the barn door open. She didn't hear the boots on the packed dirt floor. What she did hear, cutting through the deep black water of exhausted sleep, was the metallic double click of a rifle being cocked 6 feet from her face. "Don't move." The voice was low, flat, and completely without theatrics. It was the voice of someone who meant exactly what they said, and nothing more. Temperance's eyes opened. The man standing at the entrance to the stall was tall, genuinely tall, the kind of height that required him to angle his head slightly under the stall's crossbeam. He wore a canvas duster, dark from the rain, over a heavy wool shirt. His face was angular, clean-shaven, with deep-set gray eyes that were currently aimed directly at her over the barrel of a Winchester repeating rifle. He looked to be somewhere north of 35, with the kind of weathered stillness about him that came from years of spending more time with land than with people. "I'm not armed," Temperance said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'm not a thief. My horse went lame in the storm. I only needed to get out of the rain." The man studied her for a long measuring moment. His eyes moved over her with a practiced, impersonal assessment of someone checking for weapons, not cataloging a person. "You're soaked through," he said. "Yes, you'll die of cold before morning if you stay in this barn dressed like that. Possibly." Another pause. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness exactly, but a recalibration. "Can you stand?" "Yes." She stood, and the burlap sacks fell off her shoulders, and she swayed slightly before catching herself on the stall post. The man lowered the rifle without lowering his gaze. "Come up to the house," he said. "Get dry. Leave when the storm breaks." He turned and walked toward the door without waiting to see if she followed. His name was Conrad Strake. He told her this the way he told her everything, briefly, directly, as if words were a commodity he was careful not to waste. The ranch was called the Strake Place. He ran cattle and horses. He had lived here for 7 years, and he had no hired men because he preferred it that way. The house was a solid 2-story structure of limestone and timber, built to last a generation rather than to impress a visitor. Inside, a stone fireplace dominated the main room, already burning low with a good bed of coals. Conrad fed it without ceremony, adding split oak until the fire came back to life with a sound like a long exhale. He set a kettle on the iron hook over the fire, pointed to a chair near the hearth, and disappeared into a back room. He returned with a dry wool shirt, a pair of heavy canvas trousers, and a thick blanket. He set them on the arm of the chair without a word and went to the kitchen corner of the room to put together something to eat. Temperance looked at the dry clothes. She looked at the blanket. She looked at the fire. "Thank you," she said. "I can change in here if you—" "I'll stay in the kitchen," he said, not turning around. "Call when you're done." She waited until she heard the sound of him moving pots before she began to remove her riding coat. Her fingers had almost stopped working properly from the cold, clumsy, and thick-jointed. She worked the coat's brass buttons one by one, peeled the soaked canvas off her arms, and dropped it on the stone floor in front of the fire. Beneath it, she wore a heavy wool riding shirt, also soaked through. And beneath that, pressed against her skin by 11 days of constant wear, was the harness. She reached for the buckle at her left side. A floorboard creaked. Conrad Strake had not stayed in the kitchen. He stood 4 feet behind her, having come back around through the other doorway, his eyes dropping to the object strapped to her torso before either of them had time to react to the situation. Temperance spun, grabbing the wet shirt and pulling it closed across her chest, but it was too late. He had already seen it. Not her skin, the harness, the thick leather belts, the canvas pouches distended with something dense and rectangular, and riveted directly to the chest strap, a flat metal case the size of a playing card. A metal case with a hinged clasp stamped with the official seal of the United States Department of Justice. Conrad went absolutely still. "I'm sorry," he said immediately, turning away. "I came back to ask if you—" "Don't," Temperance said. The word came out sharp, involuntary, and not for the reason he'd assume. "Don't ask me about it, please." Her voice cracked on the last word in a way she hadn't intended. If I tell you what it is, you'll be in danger, and you've been decent to me. I don't want to repay that by putting a target on your house. He turned back to face her. His expression hadn't changed. It was still that same measured, careful stillness, but something behind his eyes had. How many men are following you? He asked. She stared at him. The way you said danger, he said simply. That's not an abstract fear. That's a specific number of men, a specific number of hours behind you. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she said 3, maybe 4. I lost one of them at the river crossing, I think, but I can't be certain. Conrad nodded once, slowly, as if this was a reasonable thing to hear on a Tuesday evening. Get changed, he said. Eat something. Then you're going to tell me everything. She told him in the kitchen, sitting across a plain wooden table from him, while the storm hammered the limestone walls outside, and a cast iron pot of beef and dried corn simmered between them. Her father's name was Aldous Vayo. He had been for the last 9 years the chief accountant for a man named Gideon Spur, a cattle broker out of Abilene, who on the surface bought and sold cattle along the Chisholm Trail, and beneath that surface operated an extortion network that had been systematically bleeding ranchers across 3 territories for the better part of a decade. Ranchers who refused to pay found their herds diseased, their barns burned, their hands beaten. Ranchers who still refused found worse. Temperance's father had kept the books. He had known everything. 3 months ago, he had sat down at the kitchen table in their house in Abilene and told Temperance what he had done, not to confess, but to explain. He was dying, a lung ailment that the doctor said would take him before Christmas, and he could not die with the knowledge locked inside him. He had copied the ledgers, every transaction, every payment, every name. He had bound the copies in oilskin and packed them into the harness that his brother, a railroad detective, had left at the house years ago and never retrieved. He had made Temperance swear to carry the evidence to the federal marshal in Dodge City. He had died 8 days later. Gideon Spur's men had come for the house 3 days after the funeral. Temperance had been in the barn when they arrived. She had watched through a gap in the siding as 4 men tore the house apart, room by room, looking for the ledgers her warned her they would come looking for. She had tightened the harness straps, bridled the borrowed mare from the neighbor's pasture, and ridden north before they finished searching. That was 11 days ago. Conrad had not interrupted her once. He sat with his hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, watching her face rather than her hands, listening the way people listen when they are deciding whether a thing is true. When she finished, the storm had reached its peak, the wind shrieking against the windows with a sound like something being torn. The case on the harness, Conrad said. The Justice Department's seal. My father took it off the harness and put it there himself, Temperance said. He said it would prove the documents were being surrendered as official evidence, not sold or used for leverage. He was very particular about that. Conrad set down his cup. He stared at the surface of the table for a moment. When he looked up, his gray eyes were different. Not harder, but more focused, like a lens being adjusted. My brother, he said, was a federal deputy. He was killed 4 years ago outside of Wichita, an arson case. A rancher's barn burned, the rancher died in it, and when my brother got close to figuring out who ordered the fire, he was found in a creek with a bullet in the back of his head. He said it quietly, without performance. Just the facts of it, laid out like stones. The rancher's name was Tillman, Conrad continued. He ran cattle between Wichita and the territory. He'd refused to pay protection to a broker out of Abilene. His eyes held hers. You said Gideon Spur. Temperance felt the air in the kitchen change. The ledgers, she said carefully. If my father's records go back 9 years, then Tillman's name is in them, Conrad said. Yes, she said, and your brother's case might be too. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Outside, the storm raged. The fire popped in the other room. The coffee in Conrad's cup had gone cold. Get some sleep, he said finally. I'll watch until morning. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He stood, picking up his coffee cup and carrying it to the wash basin. Spur's men will be slowed by the storm. Same storm that slowed you, But they'll be moving again at first light, and they'll know you were headed north. Greer's Crossing is the only shelter for 15 miles in any direction. They'll ask about a woman traveling alone. They'll find this place, she said. Yes, said Conrad Strake. They will. He turned from the wash basin and looked at her directly. I've got a short-barreled Greener shotgun, 2 Winchesters, and enough ammunition to make the next few hours uncomfortable for anyone who rides onto this property uninvited. And I've been waiting 4 years for something connecting my brother's murder to a name I could take to a court. He paused. So I'm not asking you to leave, Miss Vallow. I'm asking you to sleep. The dawn that came was thin and colorless, the sky scraped clean by the storm into a pale, featureless white. The sleet had stopped. The ground was a treacherous glaze of ice over mud, which was, Conrad explained, the only reason they had until mid-morning. Horses can't move fast on this, he said, standing at the front window with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. Neither can ours, but we're not going anywhere. Temperance stood beside him. She had slept 4 hours on the narrow settle in the main room, and she felt something adjacent to human again. She was wearing Conrad's shirt and trousers, which were enormous on her, the sleeves rolled up 4 times, the waist cinched with a length of cord. The harness was back in place over the shirt. She had not been able to make herself remove it. Tell me about Spur's men, Conrad said. The ones following you. Crevaston is the one to be careful of, she said. He's Spur's enforcer. He's the one who... She paused, pressing her lips together. He's the one who was at the house when my father died. He didn't do it, the illness did, but he was there. Waiting to see if there was anything worth taking. She said the last part flatly, without letting any of the feeling that went with it into her voice. He's methodical, patient. He won't rush. What about the others? 2 of them are hired muscle from Abilene. They follow whoever pays them. 3rd. She hesitated. I'm not certain. I think he's one of Spur's cattlemen. He knows the territory roads. Conrad nodded, processing this without visible reaction. Crevaston will send the 2 hired men to the front door. It's the obvious move, direct, intimidating. He'll come in from the back himself, or he'll stay back and watch. You sound like you've done this before, Temperance said. I ranched alone for 7 years, he said. You learn to think about approaches. 3 hours later, she heard the horses. Not many, 2, maybe 3. Coming down the frozen track from the direction of Greer's Crossing. Conrad heard them at the same moment she did. He set down the rifle he'd been checking and stood very still, his head slightly tilted, counting footfalls. 2 out front, he said quietly. Like I said, he looked at her. Take the back room. There's a Winchester leaning against the wall behind the door. It's loaded. I'm not hiding in the back room, she said. He looked at her for a moment, reassessing. Then stay below the windowsill, he said, and don't fire until I do. They came up the track without pretense. 2 men on frost-covered horses, sitting easy in their saddles the way men do when they believe they hold all the advantage. They stopped 20 yards from the front door. Hello, the house, the larger one called out. We're looking for a woman who came through last night. Young, dark-haired, riding a gray mare. She's wanted for theft. We're authorized agents of... You're not authorized agents of anything, Conrad said from the window, his voice carrying clean across the frozen yard. And she's not here. A pause. Now, friend, we don't want any trouble. Then turn your horses around. Another pause, longer this time. Temperance, crouched below the front window with the Winchester laid across her knees, watched the 2 men exchange a look. That's not something we can do, the large one said, and his hand moved toward his coat. The next 4 minutes were very loud and very brief. The 2 men at the front were not cowards. They came off their horses fast, using the animals for cover, firing as they moved. Conrad returned fire from the window in steady, unhurried shots, forcing them to stay behind their horses rather than advance. Temperance watched the left side of the yard, where the fence line gave way to an open approach from the north, because Conrad had told her to watch there, and she trusted his tactical red. She was right to. A man appeared around the corner of the barn. Not Crevaston, one of the others, moving fast and low with a short-barreled carbine in his hands, angling for the side window. Temperance rose from her crouch, leveled the Winchester, and said, in a voice that surprised her with its steadiness, "Stop." He didn't stop. She fired once. The shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him sideways, and he went down hard in the frozen mud. Puff. He didn't get up. But he was alive, writhing and cursing, which was what she had intended. In the yard, one of the two front men had gone down. The other had his hands raised, shouting something about surrendering. Conrad was already moving toward the door. Creviston. He hadn't been with the others. He hadn't come up the track, hadn't circled the barn, hadn't announced himself in any way that she could account for. Which meant he'd been watching, waiting. She heard the back door open. Temperance didn't think about it. She didn't calculate the risk or the distance, or what it meant to step out from behind the cover of the window frame. She turned and she moved down the short hallway to the back of the house at a run, because Conrad was outside in the front yard with a man who'd surrendered, and the only person watching the back of the house was her. Creviston was already inside the kitchen. He was a thin man, older than she'd expected, with a precise, unhurried manner that was more frightening than any volume of aggression could have been. He stood in the center of the kitchen with a revolver leveled at the back hallway, as if he'd known she was coming. "The ledgers," he said. "That's all I'm here for. Give them to me, and this ends." "It doesn't end," Temperance said. Her voice was level, her hands were not. "You know it doesn't. You knew my father. You know what's in those books." "Your father," Creviston said carefully, "was a frightened old man who made a mistake. He made a choice," she said. "There's a difference." Something moved behind Creviston's eyes, a flicker of not guilt exactly, something more pragmatic, an acknowledgement that the conversation was going in a direction he hadn't planned for. "You're 23 years old," he said. "You have your whole life. Gideon Spur is a patient man and a long-memoried one, but he is also practical. Walk away from this. Let the ledgers go. Disappear somewhere he'll never bother looking." "Like my father disappeared?" she asked quietly. "Like Deputy Strake disappeared? Like every rancher who paid and eventually ran out of money to pay with?" Creviston's jaw tightened. "Last chance," he said. "You should turn around," Temperance said, "because the man whose house this is has just come in through the front door. It was a gamble. Conrad might still be in the yard. He might not have finished with the man who'd surrendered. He might be 30 feet away or right behind her." Creviston's eyes cut to the hallway behind her. It was enough. The moment his gaze moved, Temperance dropped sideways, throwing herself against the kitchen wall, and the revolver in his hand tracked her movement exactly half a second too slowly. The shot went into the doorframe above where she'd been standing, and then Conrad Strake came through the back doorway with his rifle at his hip and said, quietly and without any particular emotion, "Drop it." Creviston was a practical man. He dropped it. The federal marshal out of Dodge City arrived at the Strake Ranch. 2 days later, summoned by a rider Conrad had sent to Greer's Crossing on the morning after the confrontation. He was a heavy-set man named Ballard with tired eyes, and the look of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by what people were capable of doing to each other for money. He sat at Conrad's kitchen table for 3 hours, reading through the copied ledgers that Temperance spread before him page by careful page. He asked precise questions and wrote the answers in a notebook, a stub of pencil. When he was finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "How long did your father keep these records?" he asked. 9 years, she said. He nodded slowly. "We have 7 open cases across 3 territories that I know of, possibly touching this network." He tapped the edge of the ledger. "This is enough to move on Spur. More than enough." He looked at her directly then, and his tired eyes were less tired than they'd been an hour ago. "Your father," he said, "did a brave thing." Temperance folded her hands on the table in front of her and held on to that sentence for a moment, turning it over. "I know," she said. "He just did it a little late." Creviston was taken to Dodge City in the marshal's custody, along with the wounded man from the barn, who turned out to be considerably more willing to talk once a federal charge was placed before him. The man who had surrendered in the yard had already provided his employer's name and location in exchange for the promise of leniency. It was the way of things with hired men. Loyalty ran only as far as the paycheck. Gideon Spur was arrested at his home in Abilene 9 days later. Temperance was there for it. She had accompanied Marshal Ballard on the formal surrender of the evidence, and she stood in the street outside Spur's office building and watched them bring him out in iron cuffs. And she wasn't sure exactly what she felt. Not satisfaction, not relief, not entirely. Something quieter and more complicated than either of those. Like a door that had been held shut against tremendous pressure, for 11 days had finally been allowed to close properly, and the silence after it was harder to adjust to than the pressure had been. She rode back to the Strake Ranch because she had left the borrowed gray mare there, and because the mare's leg had been properly rested, and the farrier from Greer's Crossing had come out to look at her and said she'd be sound in another week. It was the sensible reason. Conrad was mending fence on the east pasture when she rode back in. He saw her from a distance and came down off the fence rail and stood watching her approach with his hat pushed back on his head and a thoughtful expression on his face. "It's done," she said, pulling up the mare at the fence line. "I heard," he said. "Ballard sent word." She looked out over the east pasture. The ice had broken up. The grass was still brown and beaten down from the storm, but there were patches of it further out that had kept their color underneath the freeze, and they showed now in the slanted afternoon light as something almost green. "Deputy Strake," she said, "your brother. Ballard said the testimony will reopen the case." Conrad was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "he told me." She looked at the green patches of grass in the brown field and said, "My father kept a terrible secret for 9 years because he was afraid of what telling it would cost him. I used to think that made him a coward. Now I think it made him human. And then he told the truth at the end, which maybe made him brave. Or maybe just tired of being afraid." She paused. "I'm not sure it matters which one." Conrad leaned his forearms on the fence rail and looked out at the same pasture she was looking at. "Both things can be true," he said, "about the same person." She thought about her father sitting at the kitchen table, his voice steady despite the rattle in his lungs, laying out 11 years of regret with the clear-eyed precision of a man finally putting his accounts in order. Both things could be true. She thought he would have agreed with that if he'd had more time. The gray mare shifted beneath her, weight moving from foot to foot in the easy rhythm of a horse that is content to stand. "I don't have anywhere particular I need to be," Temperance said, not quite looking at Conrad, "for the next week or so, while the mare finishes healing." Conrad straightened up from the fence rail. He looked at her with those steady gray eyes that had first seen her over the barrel of a rifle and had, since then, shown her exactly nothing she hadn't earned his right to show her. "The east fence needs 4 more posts set before the ground freezes hard," he said. "I could use a second pair of hands." She swung down from the mare. "I can set a fence post," she said. "I figured," he said, and picked up his tools. They worked until the light gave out, and the afternoon turned cold and clean around them, and somewhere in the frozen pasture of the Kansas Territory. Without either of them remarking on it particularly, the long work of starting over had already begun.